All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. We're going to be doing a pretty intense deep dive today, looking at a report that just came out regarding all the fallout from all the changes to tariffs from the Trump administration.
Yeah, this is a big one. This is one of those kind of landmark shifts, I think, that we'll be talking about for a long time. Really changes a lot of things in the global trade landscape.
Yeah, and we want to kind of cut through the noise and really dive into like what these tariffs actually are and why they were put into place, what history tells us about these kinds of things, what are some of the economic and geopolitical shifts that we might be seeing from all this.
Right. And I mean, really, the first thing that jumps out at you when you start reading about this stuff is the scale of it. You know,
Yeah.
it's huge. And I mean, it started back on April 2nd, 2025, with what the administration is calling Liberation Day.
Yeah.
Basically a flat 10% tariff on imports from almost everywhere.
Yeah, almost everyone in the world. And then on top of that, you've got something like 60 countries facing even higher reciprocal tariffs. And these are designed to mirror what those countries are charging on U.S. goods.
Right.
So we're talking China, 34%, the EU, 20%, Vietnam's a big one at 46%,
Wow.
Taiwan, Japan, India, all with these pretty substantial double-digit tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, those are some pretty eye-popping numbers.
Yeah, and Canada and Mexico initially were spared these new reciprocal tariffs, but they're not totally off the hook. They still have some pre-existing duties, some of them tied to the USMCA, and then others that go even further back.
Right. You're talking about things like the tariffs on certain Canadian goods
Yeah.
and energy.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not even just this like blanket approach across the board. They've also targeted specific sectors.
Right.
A big one is obviously automobiles.
Yeah.
25% tariff on imported vehicles effective April 3rd.
Yeah.
And then auto parts are going to be hit starting in May. And then, of course, we can't forget the steel and aluminum tariffs that have already been in place for a while.
Yeah.
So it's a lot. There's a lot going on here. You know, and it's interesting how they calculated these reciprocal rates.
Right.
They reportedly have an estimate of what they thought would be an appropriate rate based on trade imbalances.
Oh, wow. So there was definitely some strategy there. And the report also highlights how all this phased implementation, especially for Canada and Mexico, it created a lot of uncertainty for businesses.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's dig into kind of the core rationale behind all of this. What exactly is the administration trying to achieve with all these changes?
Well, the report lays out several key objectives. You know, national security is a big one. And they're invoking, pretty weighty legislation like IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and then Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which basically says if something is, a national security threat, they can put tariffs on it.
Right.
And so they've used this justification for steel and aluminum. They've even tried to apply it to border control issues with Canada and Mexico. Yeah. And, the report points out that there's a lot of skepticism about how broadly they're using this national security justification.
Right. National security, kind of a catch-all. Makes you wonder what's really going on.
Well, yeah. And then, they've also talked about the goal of reducing trade deficits, trying to achieve fair trade through these reciprocal tariffs.
Right.
But, the report does touch on the fact that there's this debate among economists about whether focusing on bilateral deficits really makes sense.
Right. Right.
Because most economists will tell you the overall benefits of trade are much more important than just like what our balance is with one particular country.
Makes sense.
Right. And then, of course, there's this big push to revive domestic manufacturing, bring back jobs. I mean, this is a central promise of the administration.
Right.
The report acknowledges that they have made this claim, and there are some anecdotal examples maybe of companies that have benefited. But then on the other hand, you've got people saying, well, costs are going up for a lot of businesses. Automation is still a huge factor.
Yeah.
And then the final objective that the report highlights is generating revenue.
Right.
The idea being to reduce the national debt or fund tax cuts.
Sure.
But here again, the report raises a very important point. Are the increased costs that consumers and businesses are going to face going to actually outweigh any potential gains in revenue?
Right. Right. And it makes you think about, historical parallels here.
Absolutely. I mean, the report does briefly touch on some earlier tariff history in the U.S.,
Yeah.
but it really uses the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 as this cautionary tale.
Oh, yeah.
Because that was intended to protect American agriculture, but it ended up triggering these retaliatory tariffs from all around the world, and it just led to this massive collapse in international trade,
Yeah.
and actually really significantly worsened the Great Depression.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a real reminder about how these things can have some pretty serious unintended consequences.
A real sobering example there. And I mean, even something like the chicken tax back in the 60s, it shows how tariffs can really warp global production in some pretty unexpected ways. So let's talk about what the economic fallout is actually going to look like here in the U.S.
Well, the report really anticipates a lot of pain for key sectors. The automotive industry, electronics, they're both going to face higher input costs, which is probably going to mean higher prices for consumers.
Yeah.
Agriculture is very vulnerable to retaliatory tariffs, and retailers are also going to have to deal with more expensive imports.
Right.
And even the steel and aluminum industries, they might see downstream industries suffer as a result.
Uh,
Although I guess it is interesting, there was some pre-buying of autos before the tariffs went into effect.
oh,
People trying
yeah.
to beat the rush.
Yeah, yeah. So what about jobs and consumer prices? Those are kind of the big questions here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the job market.
Yep.
There may be some gains in protected industries, but then you could also see losses in other sectors because costs are going up
Right.
or because of foreign retaliation.
Right.
And automation is still a huge factor that's kind of looming over all of this.
Yeah, yeah.
And for consumers, the report pretty clearly anticipates that prices are going to go up on a lot of different goods.
Sure.
Electronics, cars, clothing. I mean, and this could contribute to inflation and ultimately slow overall economic growth.
Not a great picture domestically. So how have our trading partners reacted to all of this?
Well, the response has been pretty forceful.
Mhm.
In Canada, their leadership has vowed to take countermeasures. Mexico has been a little bit more cautious in their approach, but they've also indicated that they're willing to retaliate.
Mm.
China has been very vocal. They've condemned the tariffs as economic coercion, and they've promised to take firm countermeasures. And they've even hinted that they might coordinate with other affected countries.
Mm.
Yeah. And the EU has labeled the tariffs illegal, and they're preparing a unified response with potential retaliatory measures of their own.
Wow.
Yeah, so the prospect of a global trade war is definitely looming.
So these retaliatory tariffs, are they already in the works? They're already happening?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Canada has already announced tariffs targeting a variety of U.S. sectors.
Wow.
China has really focused on agricultural products, lumber, energy, and they've even suggested that they might be interested in pursuing a trilateral free trade agreement with some key Asian partners.
Wow.
And the EU has a long list of U.S. products that they're considering targeting with counter tariffs.
So stepping back a bit, globally, what are the major ripple effects that we should be paying attention to here?
Well, I think we can expect to see some pretty significant disruption of global trade flows.
Yeah.
I mean, we could see reduced volumes of trade being diverted to other partners,
Mm.
just general inefficiencies in the system,
Mm.
and international supply chains are going to face higher costs, delays, and this is going to force businesses to really rethink their strategies, and it's just going to create a lot of uncertainty for investment.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, of course, the whole role of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, is really under the microscope now,
Right.
because this is really challenging a lot of its core principles. The U.S. has been very critical of the WTO.
Yeah.
China's already filed a case with the WTO over these tariffs. So it really raises questions about the future of the WTO, the future of the whole rules-based system of international trade.
And what about the geopolitical ramifications of all this?
Well, we're already seeing strained relationships with some of America's oldest and closest allies, Canada, Mexico, the EU.
Mm.
And this could accelerate a shift in global economic alliances, potentially giving China more influence in Asia.
Hmm.
And it's even raising questions about whether the U.S. is really committed to alliances like NATO.
Mm.
These America First policies are definitely reshaping the geopolitical landscape. It's a very different world.
So at the end of the day, this deep dive into the report really shows us that the Trump administration's tariffs are a huge shift towards protectionism. And, the report really highlights how there are a lot of risks of negative economic and geopolitical consequences. And we're already starting to see some of these things play out. It's a little bit frightening, honestly, when you think about some of the historical lessons that we've talked about.
Yeah, and that brings us to a point that I think it's really important for all of us to think about. We live in a very interconnected global economy, and these measures, they might seem like they're just focused on, protecting America, but they could end up having much broader effects. How are they going to reshape, not just trade, but also international power dynamics, and ultimately even our daily lives as consumers? What kinds of long-term adjustments are we all going to have to make as individuals, as businesses, in this new environment? These are really important questions that we all need to be thinking about.
Yeah, some really big questions to ponder as we move forward in this new trade landscape. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.